4 males, 4 females, a sealed enclosure with food that never ran out and water that never ran dry. No disease, no predators, no competition from outside. Every obstacle a mouse might face had been eliminated before the experiment even began. 5 years later, every one of them was dead. Not one of those deaths had a diagnosable cause. No infection, no starvation, nothing a veterinarian could have named on a report. They died of something Calhoun hadn't measured, hadn't even thought to measure. This is Universe 25, and it may be the most unsettling window into social collapse that science has ever produced. John Calhoun had been chasing a single question for 2 decades. What does a society become when struggle disappears? By the time he built Universe 25, he had already run 24 earlier versions, in outdoor enclosures, barns, and lab rooms, watching the same arc play out every time. The population explodes. Violence erupts. The colony's social fabric tears open. Then the whole thing collapses. 24 times. Universe 25 was designed to settle the argument once and for all. He built it inside a federal research lab in Maryland, 9 feet square. Walk-up apartments stacked along every wall, connected by mesh tunnels running floor to ceiling. Food dispensers that never emptied. Water bottles that never ran low. Calhoun estimated the enclosure could sustain around 3,800 mice. It would never reach half that number. 8 founders went in on day 1. Calhoun sealed the lid. Nothing happened for the first 100 days. The mice explored the space, settled into territories, and figured out who slept where. Then the first litters arrived. The population began doubling on a 55-day cycle. By day 315, over 600 animals were pressing against each other on the ramps, sleeping in piles, competing for nesting space near the tops of the apartments. That's when it started breaking. In a natural colony, overcrowding has a pressure valve. Younger males leave and find new territory somewhere else. But Universe 25 had no somewhere else. The young males, with no role to claim and no ground to occupy, drifted toward the center of the pen and stopped engaging with the world. Calhoun watched them for hours, healthy, well-fed animals doing absolutely nothing. When one was attacked, he absorbed the blows, moved a short distance, and lay down again. The females, without stable positions in the social structure, climbed to the highest apartments and withdrew. They stopped seeking mates. They stopped reproducing. Elsewhere in the enclosure, Calhoun observed what he called the behavioral sink. Even with food distributed throughout the space, mice began crowding compulsively around just a handful of feeders. A station loaded with food but surrounded by no other mice became functionally useless. The feeding instinct had become so tied to social presence that eating alone didn't register. Density around a few spots turned extreme, while the rest of the enclosure went almost untouched. Then the mothers who were still trying to raise litters began to fail. The males who had built territories grew exhausted defending them and stopped protecting their families. Mothers found themselves nursing and guarding nests simultaneously alone. Pups were abandoned in scattered corners. Some mothers lost track of which pups were theirs. Others stopped recognizing them altogether. In the worst sections of the colony, no more than 1 pup in 20 made it to weaning. But none of that was the strangest thing Calhoun would put on record. The pups who survived to adulthood grew up inside a hollowed-out society. No functioning fathers, barely functional mothers. The behaviors that normally pass down through generations, how to court, fight, defend, care for young, were never transmitted. They behaved in ways Calhoun had never seen in any of his 24 prior experiments. They never competed. They never attempted to mate. They had no social behavior of any kind. They ate, they slept, and they groomed themselves with complete consistency. He gave them a name, the Beautiful Ones. Their coats were perfect. No scars, no wounds, because there had never been any conflict. By every physical measure, they looked like the healthiest animals in the enclosure. But they had, without apparent pain or crisis, simply opted out of participating in the species. And here is where this stops being a mouse story. In Japan, more than 1 million people currently live as hikikomori, individuals who have withdrawn from all social participation for 6 months or more. Japan's Cabinet Office documented roughly 514,000 of them between the ages of 15 and 39 in 2016. Then another 613,000 between 40 and 64 in 2019. The crisis has been running long enough to generate its own generational label, the 80-50 problem. Parents in their 80s still providing for withdrawn children in their 50s. In China, in April 2021, a post called Lying Flat is Justice spread across the Baidu platform. Its author had spent 2 years without work and found it entirely manageable. Millions of young people responded. They called it Tangping, refusing the relentless work culture, refusing marriage, refusing ambition. Xi Jinping personally condemned it in a speech that October, calling it a threat to national development, which raised a question worth sitting with. Development toward what exactly? Universe 25 peaked at 2,200 mice on day 560. After that, the count only fell. The last recorded conception happened on day 920. No more mice were born after that. The beautiful ones kept grooming. The isolated females stayed in their upper apartments. The colony aged forward in silence until the last mouse died in May 1973, roughly 5 years after the founders first went in. Calhoun's paper was called Death Squared, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine. When the findings reached a general audience, the interpretation was nearly uniform. Comfort kills. Abundance without struggle destroys. Tom Wolfe had already written an essay on New York City. Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb had linked Calhoun's data to fears about global overpopulation. Welfare critics used the mice as an argument against social safety nets. Urban planners cited them against high-density housing. Everyone found their preferred lesson somewhere in the data and ran with it. But that reading missed what Calhoun actually concluded. His finding wasn't about comfort. It was about the disappearance of meaningful roles. The population had grown faster than the colony could produce genuine positions for mice to occupy. Not food, not space positions. Fighter, mate, parent, protector. The structural roles that gave each individual a real reason to function within the group. Once those ran out, the mice who arrived with nothing to fill didn't adapt. They withdrew from the business of being alive. And here's the part that is difficult to look at directly. You don't need a 9-foot enclosure to produce that outcome. You need a generation that showed up after all the slots were already taken. You need a system generating more qualified people than it has meaningful things for them to do. You need that quiet, persistent experience of being fed and housed and technically fine, while feeling structurally unnecessary. That is not a rodent problem. That is a human description that a mouse experiment happened to surface first. Calhoun never accepted that the ending was fixed. He kept building new environments after Universe 25, enclosures designed around challenge and engagement rather than pure provision. He believed that when physical space runs out, the only expansion that matters is into what he called ideational generativity. New ideas, new forms of work, new roles that didn't exist before. He spent the rest of his career trying to prove it was achievable. He died in 1995. The experiment he is most associated with ran for 5 years, but the question underneath it has never closed. Not just what destroys a society that appears to have everything, but what do you do when you start to recognize yourself in the beautiful ones? Thank you for watching and sticking till the end.